Welcome. I'm KAL RAUSTIALA. I direct the Burkle Center for International Relations here at UCLA. And as many of you know, one of the important things that we do is try to bring the most interesting, most significant speakers, policymakers, thinkers, doers to campus to talk to us about the pressing issues of the day, their experiences, and to enlighten us about foreign affairs generally. And for nearly 4 decades, the Bernard Brodie Lecture has been one of the key ways that we do that. So the late Bernard Brodie, some of you may know, was a UCLA professor, one of the kind of chief Cold War strategists. And this lecture always has had a national security bent to it as a result. The list of previous Brodie lecturers includes presidents, prime ministers, secretaries of state and defense, national security advisors, Nobel Prize winners, US senators, governors, and of course ambassadors. And today, it's a great honor to welcome Ambassador John Emerson to that list. In a moment, I'm going to introduce him properly. Let me just say a little bit about the ground rules. So Ambassador Emerson will come up in a moment. He will speak for 15 to 20 minutes as he likes from the podium. Then he and I will sit down in those chairs. We'll have a brief conversation, and then we'll open it up to all of you. Now, if you've been to these events before, you know we have handheld mics. Alexandra, do we? Yes? Good. Okay, so we have handheld mics. So when it's time for questions, please wait for those microphones. Of course, wait to be called on. And keep your questions concise and to the point. So, with that in mind, let me introduce our special guest. Ambassador John Emerson began his career as a lawyer at the firm of Manat Phelps after graduating from the University of Chicago Law School, but he was always deeply involved in politics and policy throughout his career. Ambassador Emerson served as general counsel in Jerry Brown's U.S. Senate race back in 1982, served as the LA Deputy City Attorney, and I'm just listing some of the things he's done. Bill Clinton's campaign manager for California, and then after Bill Clinton's victory in 1992 as Deputy Director for Intergovernmental Affairs, where Ambassador Emerson helped shepherd the creation of the World Trade Organization through Congress, significant event, still reverberating today. After many years back in the private sector here in Los Angeles at the Capital Group, he was chosen by President Obama and confirmed by the US Senate as the American ambassador to Germany on August 1, 2013, and he served in that role until the inauguration of President Trump on January 20th of this year. Ambassador Emerson received the State Department's Cobb Award for Exemplary Diplomatic Service, and please join me in welcoming Ambassador John Emerson. Thank you.
It is a great privilege to have been asked to deliver the Brodie Lecture on the Conditions of Peace. I must say, after hearing that list of dignitaries who've done this before, I think we've been downgraded a little bit today, but you know, hopefully we'll try to make this interesting and informative and maybe even entertaining. So on January 20th, my family and I came home after spending 3.5 incredibly rewarding but also challenging years living in LA's sister city, Berlin. Serving as the American ambassador to Germany was truly the honor of my life, and it proved to be an extraordinary experience for our entire family. Our time in Germany was anything but uneventful. Consider the following: the NSA disclosures, the Russian incursion into the Ukraine and the illegal annexation of Crimea, civil war in Syria, the brutality of ISIL, the metastasizing of terrorism into Europe and the United States, the resilience of the Taliban in Afghanistan, the Greek financial crisis, Brexit, the threat of Ebola, the loud and vocal opposition to TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement, in the one European country that would have benefited most from that agreement, the demise of Safe Harbor and the damage that that posed to intergovernmental or intercompany data transfers, the threat to our governments, our economies, our societies, and our politics of sophisticated, increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks, and the greatest movement of refugees through Europe at any time since the end of the Second World War. This is a job that took me from Berlin to Afghanistan to Kiev, to our major military bases within Germany, to Strasbourg and Brussels, and for the EU and NATO, 1 mile underground in a coal mine, 40,000 feet up, pulling 7 Gs in an F-16, and landing on the carrier Harry S. Truman in the middle of the Mediterranean. In short, a lot of once-in-a-lifetime experiences on top of multiple consequential challenges for the United States, for Germany, and for Europe. Throughout my tenure as ambassador, during which we saw a change in governments in the UK, Italy, Spain, and the EU, Germany has been an island of stability, an indispensable ally. And I had the privilege of serving there at a time when we finally had an answer to that iconic question, first posed by Henry Kissinger: when I want to phone Europe, who do I call? Her name is Angela Merkel, and she actually worked in an office that, as Cal knows, because he's been there, and Jeff and some others of you, I could actually see from my office across the Tiergarten. Our relationship with Germany and with Europe has actually been in the news quite a bit lately, especially with the Chancellor's recent visit to the White House, Sunday's French elections, Germany's September elections coming up, and of course the beginnings of the negotiation of Brexit. And what I want to briefly talk to you about, and hopefully this will give some food for thought for the discussion portion afterwards, is why one of the most critical conditions of peace is a strong and unified Europe working in partnership with the United States. As I intimated in the summer of 2013, 8 weeks after I arrived in Berlin, news broke of the NSA scandal involving Chancellor Merkel's cell phone. And I'll tell you, that was quite a way to begin one's term as ambassador. And I think the initial reaction that a lot of us had to that news was, well, you know, the German objection to this is sort of like that guy in Casablanca. You know, I'm shocked to see the gambling's going on in this instance. Oh, you're winning, sir. But in point of fact, because of 50 years through the Stasi and the Third Reich, of the German government using information about people and intelligence to control and oppress and suppress the populace, this is a highly, highly sensitive issue in Germany. And I made a decision shortly after the news broke and we were dealing with it, and I was in the middle of that and helping to frame the president's response to the whole situation. But I made a decision that I was going to strap on the flak vest and go out there, travel the country, meet with reporters, editorial boards, college students, town halls, and try to address this issue in a very forthright manner, at least as well as I could. Now, my guidance from the State Department was, you should say, I'm sorry, we don't comment on intelligence matters. Now, I sort of knew that that wouldn't cut it, but I also knew you couldn't really get into details. And my first experience on this was, as we made this decision, I had about 72 hours of nonstop interviews with journalists and roundtables and all that. And the sort of final thing I did was I appeared live on Morgan Magazine, which for any of you who know Germany know it's sort of an amalgam. It's the morning news show. If you think of the Today Show, Good Morning America, CBS Morning News put together, 4 to 6 million people watch it every morning, pretty much everybody in the federal government. And so this was sort of my introduction to the German people on this issue. And they were kind enough to have me on, have me live there on the set. Of course, it's all in German. My German, not that good, so I had the thing in my ear with the guy speaking English. And they brought me on, and meanwhile put on a big screen like this, one of the Bundestag members who thought it was a good idea to actually travel to Moscow, interview Edward Snowden, and then, talk about that. So meanwhile, the anchor, I'm standing here, the anchor's standing here, he's interviewing this guy who's just going bang, bang, bang on the United States and on this whole issue. And then, of course, he turns to me like that. Now, I can't tell you to this day what I said, but that night, I went to an event, and at this point, I was pretty radioactive. There weren't a whole lot of people wanting to come up and have their picture taken with the American ambassador. But I came up that night and I saw Wolfgang Schäuble, who I just met with for the first time a week or so before. Now, Schäuble is an iconic character He is the oldest serving Bundestag member. He's in a wheelchair because of an assassination attempt about 20 years ago. And for 8 years, he's been the finance minister, think Treasury Secretary, of Germany, and is really the guy that helped Germany move through the economic crisis of 2008, 2009. And he's a very, this is pretty much about as straight shooter as you'd want to see. So he sees me, and he goes, "Come over here." So I thought, oh boy, here we go. So I walk over, bend over, shake his hand. "Oh, Herr Minister, it's so good to see you." And he goes, "I saw you on television this morning. You said nothing, but you said it very well." Now that is a good ambassador. In any event, the whole NSA thing got a lot of attention. It certainly got a lot of attention back here. I had many condolence phone calls and letters from probably some of you in this room. But what is less known is that until then, the larger German concern was the impending U.S. pivot to Asia. From the minute I stepped, on German soil, this is what I heard about. And there was great concern about what that would mean for the transatlantic relationship. And so while the German public was outraged by the spying allegations, the concerns of many in government and civil society were much less about being listened to and much more about the likelihood that the scandal would undermine our crucial partnership. Why was there so much concern about this? Well, during the early post-war years, the transatlantic partnership was born out of a commitment to the European project with the goal of a fully democratic Europe that was whole, free, and at peace. It was a project fueled by a commitment to mutual security, prosperity, and trust, and it has proven to be one of the great success stories of world history. But as a result of the explosive spying disclosures, its foundational trust had been badly shaken, thereby jeopardizing its stability. Now, fortunately, through more than 3 years of work together on a multitude of emerging challenges, some of which I mentioned earlier, we were able to rebuild this trust. And this reconstruction was best illustrated by the extraordinarily close partnership that developed between President Obama and Chancellor Merkel. And I think that was probably best demonstrated by the fact that President Obama made his last presidential trip overseas to Germany, literally spent 2.5 days because, quote, I want to say goodbye to my good friend Angela Merkel. And by the way, in about 10 days, he will be going to Berlin once again at her invitation on his first post-presidential trip overseas. But with the election of a new president, who campaigned on a foreign policy platform that was far more isolationist in nature than the long-held bipartisan consensus in administrations going all the way back to Harry S. Truman and the Marshall Plan, and whose campaign entailed concerning assertions about NATO, the EU, and Germany in particular, German angst about transatlantic ties had once again come front and center. And while the president pushed back on the isolationist label in his last month's joint press conference with the chancellor, his declarations of America First and his pursuit of policies and budget priorities that reinforce an American retreat from global engagement have given our allies great pause. At last February's Munich Security Conference, this is an annual conference, sort of the Davos World Economic Forum of national security, it was attended by Vice President Pence, Defense Secretary Mattis, Homeland Security Secretary Kelly, and the largest congressional delegation that had ever attended, led, as always, by John McCain. Yet last month, when I was in Berlin, one prominent government official noted that while past Munich security conferences had focused on Russia and terrorism and Eurozone economics, the primary concern this year was the United States. And this isn't just a German concern. Having recently celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome and witnessed the formal beginning of the Brexit process, European op-ed pages and transatlantic think tanks are filled with dire predictions about the future of Europe. Is European integration and the dream of a Europe whole, free, and at peace slowly beginning to crumble. Well, fortunately, the populist surge that gave us Brexit, empowered Le Pen, and fueled Germany's Alternative for Deutschland seems to have stalled for the moment. And this is good, because at the same time, Russia is aggressively pursuing a hybrid warfare approach in Europe through overt and covert support of right-wing, anti-Euro, anti-American populist movements, as well as an extensive propaganda effort on the internet and through traditional media. And let me tell you something, folks, this ain't your father's Soviet propaganda. It is a very sophisticated, well-funded effort, especially through social media trolls and postings of incendiary assertions masquerading as news items. In fact, recently, the New York Times called out the weaponization of information by an extensive Russian disinformation campaign that journalists in Germany have long been aware of. Beyond that, we saw the hack of Macron's party emails, fortunately with little effect. And by the way, you should know that about a year and a half ago, Russia hacked into the Bundestag email system well in advance of Germany's federal elections, which are coming up this September 24th. With all of this, the unwavering commitment of the United States to the European project becomes more important than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Deep engagement with our European allies in both NATO and the EU is very much an essential condition of peace. Consider the following. At a time when our shared values of rule of law, free elections with an informed electorate, and the freedoms of press, speech, and religious expression are under attack around the globe, we need to stand with our allies to defend them. The most severe challenges we face globally, nuclear proliferation, climate change, cyber threats, and global terrorism cannot be solved by unilateral US or European action or by inaction. Shared intelligence with our European allies is critical to combating terrorism and protecting our citizens, especially in the current environment where non-state actors and metastasizing terrorist groups, having learned how our intelligence services operate thanks to leaked information, have become very adept at using evolving technology to recruit and to train and to plan and to carry out attacks. Working together with our allies is critical to successfully defeating ISIL, deterring Russian aggression, but ultimately to building and winning the peace. Accordingly, our continued support of NATO, and make no mistake, Trump's right about this, and this came up in every bilateral meeting I participated in between the President and the Chancellor, our allies must carry a much bigger load when it comes to funding NATO and national security or our joint defense efforts than they currently do. But our continued support of NATO is essential to maintaining global stability and to deterring Russian aggression in what Vladimir Putin believes to be Russia's zone of influence. And finally, the shared prosperity that is facilitated by a rules-based trading system, which has, in stark contrast to protectionist experiments of the past, lifted millions out of poverty, is an essential component of global stability and therefore of our national security. Why? Because in today's interconnected world, there is an intimate connection between prosperity and peace, between the creation of economic opportunity and the greater potential for political stability. Economic policy and foreign policy, as John Kerry was fond of saying, are two sides of the same coin. This argues for strengthening our economic and our trading ties with Europe. But the biggest lesson of the past campaign in this country, and a fundamental root cause of the rise of nationalism in Europe, is that many Americans and European workers and families have been hurt by the localized costs of globalization, automation, the financial meltdown, and jobs being shipped overseas without necessarily feeling the benefits of trade, which are far more diffuse, but also very real. Accordingly, trade and economic negotiations between the EU and the United States should recommence, but only in conjunction with policies that address the reality that many have been left behind by the rapid pace of globalization and automation. Now, I've said that our relationship with Europe is an indispensable condition of peace, or our having a strong relationship with Europe, but I will conclude by pointing out that this isn't a one-way street. Europe's got a lot of work to do as well to maintain that strong relationship. NATO members must honor the 2% of GDP defense spending commitment that they all made at the NATO Wales Summit in the fall of 2014. Intelligence gathering and sharing, which is currently quite balkanized among our European allies, needs to be more robust. The EU and Germany have got to get past their 20th century approaches to privacy and recognize that we need rules of commerce that are reflective of how data actually moves in the global economy. The EU and its member states must invest more in internet infrastructure and in cybersecurity. The EU and the UK must negotiate a Brexit that, if possible, enhances rather than detracts from the strength of the alliance. European leaders need to push back more aggressively against anti-American sentiment, which hobbles efforts to share intelligence and successfully conclude bilateral agreements. And beyond that, the EU needs to reform even how it negotiates agreements, so that negotiators don't have to answer to multiple bosses the way they do today, and a single province of a single member state cannot hold up the enactment of a fully concluded agreement, as was the case with the EU-Canadian trade agreement earlier this year. And finally, the EU needs to reform its regulatory processes, which give rise to resentment and to grassroots frustrations in the member states, thereby fueling anti-Euro sentiment. Only by addressing these concerns on both sides of the Atlantic can we be confident that the European project, instrumental in the past and critical to the future, will continue to thrive and progress in the face of today's challenges. And because, as I hope I've made clear, the continuing success of the European project is, and this is because, as I hope I've made clear, the continuing success of the European project is an essential condition of peace. I look forward to hearing your comments, to having Cal ask me some questions, and then, of course, having the opportunity to engage with all of you. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So many things you raised at the end are interesting and important, and we can't cover them all. But let's start with NATO. And you talked about the 2% pledge. My understanding, 2% of GDP spent on defense. My understanding is that several German politicians have just rejected that. Not realistic. We're not going to do it. And if you compare the United States, it's something like 3.5% of GDP. Russia, 5%. So it's a significant gap. So what can the U.S. do to get Germany, and maybe others too, but Germany's the biggest economy, to increase that spending? Is it realistic? Can we expect it?
Well, I mean, some German politicians have said we're not going to do this. Other German politicians have said they ought to, they ought to just demilitarize entirely and get rid of their army. I mean, the reality is the policy of Chancellor Merkel, the policy of her government, which is a grand coalition government with the Social Democrats, is a commitment to that 2% level. And in point of fact, in the last year and a half, their budget actually has gone up, not just arithmetically, but it not just gone up in terms of the numbers, but it's actually gone up as a percentage of what they're spending. Now, they aren't there yet, but she and her government are very, very, very committed to that. So, look, at the end of the day, it's a lot about job owning. My view is this is a commitment all these NATO members made in Wales in 2014, and it's a lot easier to hold someone's feet to the fire on a commitment they've already made than it is to get them to make a new commitment. So I think we're just going to keep pushing it. And by the way, it's not just us. I mean, countries like Poland and the Baltics that are also over 2%, you know, they're putting the pressure on them as well.
Sure, they're more on the front lines. So how do Germans, just Russia's obviously on everyone's mind right now, how do Germans, in your experience, the German government in particular, see the threat from Russia now? Is that a serious threat to them?
Germans are very schizophrenic about Russia. I mean, first of all, they were at ground zero of the Cold War, and they have absolutely no desire to return to that position. Let's be honest about that. Secondly, you've got, you know, 2/3 of the country grew up in the West. Honestly, they felt that particularly the United States liberated them from the tyranny of Hitler. I mean, that's sort of the, you can talk about that in other senses in terms of people's participation in that process, but fundamentally that's how people look at it today. They learned English as a second language. Their kid, every time I talked to the military, and you know, we had 35,000 troops in Germany, and I did that a lot. I always said, I have the title, but you guys are the real ambassadors because you're living in the community, your kids are going to school with German kids, on and on. But I mean, I can't tell you how many times when I'm in the West, I hear stories about, you know, people being on exchange programs, or their children growing up with the children of American servicemen and women and that kind of thing, and how excited they are to travel to the United States. You go to the former East, these folks learned Russian as a second language, including the chancellor, by the way. And for a lot of us, I think I had a misperception. I actually thought that when the fall of the wall occurred, it was sort of a kumbaya moment. I'm not, you know, not a kumbaya, a ding dong, the witch is dead moment for Germans. You know, it's like, oh, thank God, the wall's down. And I think it was for a lot of younger people on the East, but it was in point of fact a terrifying moment for many of the people in the East, particularly those who were, say, from their mid-40s on up. First of all, think about this. Out of 18 million people, 1.5 million were on the payroll of the Stasi. Well, that's drying up. Number two, everybody in East Germany, in the GDR, lost their job at the same moment, you know. They had no idea what the value of their savings was going to be. They had no idea what whether their pensions were going to be honored or not. And while young people were perfectly happy to move west and get jobs and go to school and this and that, you know, these guys had learned how to operate and survive and in some instances thrive in a system that we all look at with a certain level of horror. And I would encourage everybody to see that extraordinary film, The Lives of Others, about that experience. But for them, it was like this was the system they knew, and now they're going to be thrown into a market economy. But also growing up learning Russian and maybe having their kids go to school with the children of Russian soldiers, there's a sort of comfort level in dealing with Russia where there isn't so much in dealing with America and the West. So you have that dynamic. The third dynamic is the business dynamic. There's a big constituency in Germany, particularly coming out of some elements of the business community. I call them the Greater Switzerland crowd, which is sort of like, hey, why do we have to choose between Russia and the United States? Let's just be friends with everybody. It's good for business. And so you have a fairly schizophrenic group. So the Grand Coalition sort of began to exhibit a little bit of a fault line on this issue, because on the one hand you had Angela Merkel and her Christian Democratic Union, who traditionally have been much stronger on as it relates to addressing Russian aggression. She grew up in the former East, but she sees it from very clear eyes of and President Gauck, who was at that time the president of Germany, grew up. His father was disappeared by the Stasi for several years. He was a pastor over there. Angela Merkel's father was a pastor in the former East. They were always targeted by the Stasi. So, you know, fundamentally, she's very clear-eyed about, sort of understanding Russia. The Social Democrats are the party of Willy Brandt and Ostpolitik. They tend to be more, you know, hey, let's work with these folks and what have you. So they were always the first to begin calling for a stepping down of sanctions that were imposed in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea and effectively the invasion of eastern Ukraine and the Donbass region. And my view on that, and I think our policy view on that is, it is really important in the 21st century to make very, very clear to stronger nations that the global community will not sanction the redrawing, the unilateral redrawing of the boundary lines of smaller, weaker countries. This is not the way that we need to be going at this point in time, and it doesn't work to impose sanctions and then 2 years later, because you get lazy, because you get tired, because maybe it's not good for the economy, or maybe, as we saw in the campaign, because somebody says something nice about you, to step down those sanctions. And she absolutely sees that and feels that way. Now, she feels that way, but has probably spent more time, we used to jokingly call her the Putin whisperer, more time with Vladimir Putin than just about any other foreign leader, working through the Minsk process and developing all that. But she has always tried to have put pressure on Russia in regard to response to what they did, but have a very brightly lit off-ramp towards a diplomatic solution. The Social Democrats were much more, okay, maybe we ought to start, well, good behavior, which in Putin's case is often stopping bad behavior, and then saying, hey, look at me, I stopped doing that. But good behavior should be rewarded with a little bit of bringing down of sanctions. And then the final thing, in terms of Germany's attitude towards Russia, is you do have a whole host of Germans that feel a sense of collective guilt for 20 million Soviet citizens killed during the Second World, actually it was more like 40 million, 20 million Russians killed during the Second World War. And there is also a great appreciation and admiration for the Russian soul and the Russian capacity for enduring suffering, interestingly enough. So you get all of that. And, but again, I think if Martin Schulz were to become the next chancellor and not Angela Merkel, you probably would see a softening of that sanctions policy.
Thanks. So a moment ago you were critical, or you alluded a bit to problems or differences between the U.S. and Germany with regard to data and privacy and so forth. So let's flip that for a second. What can we learn from Germany about the balance between privacy and security?
Well, I think that I think one thing to learn is you got to have better transparency. You need to try to get buy-in from the public about what we are doing and what we aren't doing and why we are doing that. I think that's something in the wake of the disclosure about the Chancellor's cell phone the President tried to do with his reforms. He gave a speech, an important speech that I don't think got enough attention on January 17th of 2014, where he really outlined a lot of the reforms that he was making with regard to the NSA and metadata and how all that process works. So, I mean, number one, you need to have more transparency. Number two, I think you can learn what not to do, which is in Germany, it's 90% about privacy and 10% about intelligence and all that. Angela Merkel does not get a PDB, a President's Daily Brief. She doesn't get it.
Daily intelligence briefing.
Daily intelligence brief. I thought saying President's Daily Brief would be enough for this audience, but anyway, daily intelligence briefing. And what happens is her top advisors will get briefings and so on and so forth. But because of what I articulated earlier about the 50-year history of the way intelligence was tragically misused in Germany, because of that, the German politicians tend to be very arm's length from their intelligence community. It's almost like Sergeant Schultz. I don't want to. Oh God, don't quote me on that. If anybody, but there's a little bit of I don't want to know. And
the students are all confused.
Yeah. Okay. That's true. Good point. We got a generational thing going on. But in any event, that's there needs to be more of a focus on that. But I'll tell you, the best illustration of the differences between American views, and privacy is obviously important here, but American views on privacy and German views on privacy, it also relates to the internet. And a couple of illustrations there. The Social Democratic Party, when they negotiated with Merkel's party, the CDU, the coalition agreement, you know, you have an election and then they form a coalition, then they actually negotiate what they're going to do, and then because, of course, the government rises out of the legislative branch, it all gets done, which is actually kind of an interesting thing, or like to see in our country,
Novel
maybe.
idea.
Shocking. In any event, in negotiating that agreement, Sigmar Gabriel, who was the leader of the Social Democrats, said, we're gonna send this out and have all of our members, you know, vote on it. And if they all vote to approve it, then fine, it's going to be done. And they're sending it out by snail mail. And so I said to him, and I said, why don't you just email it to people and have it, you know, you can get it done. It was going to take 3 weeks or something. Get it done faster. He says, oh, we don't have the email addresses. In fact, we don't have the physical addresses of most of our party members. Well, why not? Well, he never would ask for that. You know, that would be an invasion of privacy. If they want to give it to us, we will take it and build a database of it. You can, all of you involved in politics, you can't get voter files in Germany. They don't have a list of like who lives where and who's a Democrat and who's a Republican and how many times they vote, you know, the kind of stuff that, you know, our political consultants make a fortune, you know, selling to campaigns and working on. You don't get that in Germany. But my favorite illustration is when it comes to Google Street View. So if you go on Google Street View anywhere in Germany, you will find pixelation after pixelation as people say, oh my God, how can you have my house on there? This is a terrible violation of my privacy. And so I met the head of, actually it was the head of Twitter Germany, who used to be the head of Google Street View Germany. And I said, look, I've heard this anecdotally. I talk about it all the time. Is this true? He goes, yeah. He says, I said, well, what about your colleague and you know, your counterpart in California? What's his experience? He goes, oh, he says, that's a riot. He said, I called him up. I said, are you having this problem? He goes, no. He says, my problem is, well, you know, the people phoning us saying, when's that car coming down the street? Because they want to stand out there and wave. Hey, little Billy, you're on TV, you know? So, I mean, big, big differences, and it relates to our eagerness to be first adapters of new technologies that come out and their fundamental distrust of Facebook and of Google, and let me tell you, Facebook and social media in general, and Amazon, and those companies have a lot of trouble in Germany and they have a lot of trouble in Europe. And I fear, which is why I said what I said in my remarks, I fear that the EU in particular is erecting barriers with this as an excuse effectively to allow European companies to play catch-up because we're so far ahead of them in this area.
Clearly. So let me turn to Brexit. You
Sure.
mentioned that, and so 2 questions. I'm curious what the reaction was the next day in Germany amongst the people you talked to, but also what do you think the longer-term impact is for Germany? So obviously it makes Germany an even more central player. It takes out a big player. But are there other interesting things about how it's likely to play out for the EU?
Well, it's a couple of things I think are of interest there. I mean, one, and by the way, when the Brexit vote happened, I mean, a lot of Germans were shocked. The initial feeling was almost hurt. It's like, you want to leave us? You know, why do you not? I mean, literally just in talking to people. I mean, it was
Insulted.
It was. I'm telling you, it was more hurt than insult. But then, about 3 days after the Brexit vote, it was the European Cup, the soccer final. And by the way, soccer is everything in Germany in terms of the. I happened to be lucky enough to be there when they won the World Cup, which was great fun. But so it was the game when it was Iceland beat England. And I happened to be on a barge on the Spree. It was one of these, you know, somebody we knew had like 60 people. It was a big cocktail party, and we were all having fun. And the game was on. And people are watching the game, and they're watching Iceland beat England. There was a lot of schadenfreude, let me tell you, around that. Oh, Brexit Part 2, now they're exiting the European Cup, you know. But I mean, that gives you a sense of kind of the personal attitude. But obviously, there's a huge concern on several fronts. First of all, you have a lot of young Germans that work in the UK. You have a lot of Brits that work in Germany. What's the impact of that going to be? At one of my many goodbye, events where I, do my, come and talk or whatever. But I sat at a table and I had on one side of me the head of Ford Motor Europe, and on the other side, the head of Opel, and which is a GM asset. And both of them have huge manufacturing facilities in Germany. They're both German. And they were very worried because while they manufacture the cars themselves and assemble them in Germany, the engines are built in the UK. So it's like, whoa, what's going to happen there? Are we going to have taxes put on that or what have you? But the fundamental problem is that, as the Chancellor has made clear, there are 3 or 4 inviolable tenets of the EU. One of them is free movement of goods, and the other one is free movement of people. And if you are going to adopt a policy that restricts the movement of people, which you can't cherry pick. Sure. You can't say, oh, we'll take your engineers, but we're not going to share in the refugees who are coming through, as an example. And the second piece of it is that nobody on the EU side, and I thought it was very interesting that a couple of weeks ago, the 27 remaining member states, it took them about 10 minutes to basically agree upon a very firm negotiating posture in opening the negotiations on Brexit. Which, by the way, to get those guys to agree on anything quickly is like a miracle and a half, so that just shows you where firm they are. But the problem is you don't want to create a deal that is so good for the Brits that other countries say, hey, I want that deal. And so I think it's going to be very, very tricky. Obviously, Germany is going to care about protecting German citizens who are in the UK and their livelihood. And at the same time, they're going to care about their business and economic relationship. But fundamentally, they don't want to negotiate a deal that's so attractive that it could end up with the UK being the first brick in the wall that begins to crumble. And that's why, obviously, the election in France was, it's not the end of the story, I said, for now in my talk, but it's certainly a sigh of relief, particularly for Angela Merkel. And think about it, Merkel literally has no partners at this point. And so I think she's thrilled to now have a junior partner. I mean, both Cameron and Renzi basically blew themselves up by putting referendum on the ballots and saying, oh, I'm going to resign if this doesn't pass. And Hollande has been pretty weak for quite a long time. Spain didn't even have a government for a big chunk of time when I was there. So it's really Angela Merkel on her own, which was exciting for me because it meant I got to participate in a whole lot of issues that I might not have otherwise been able to participate in as the bilateral ambassador. But it's, I know she is very happy to see the French election turn out the way it did.
Sure. So, given that you were there during the election, I don't think it's a partisan point to make that there are many ties between those around the President Trump, and either white nationalist or neo-Nazi groups here in the U.S. Many ties that have been shown throughout. How is that perceived in Germany? How widely was that known?
I'm not sure if that was known in Germany, but don't forget, a lot of Germans hear a certain kind of rhetoric and they go, I've seen this movie before, and so now I happen to be very vociferously against Hitler analogies. I think they're people make them way too quickly, particularly on the left, in both countries, candidly, and I think all it does is denigrate the horror of the Holocaust and what happened, and people really shouldn't be doing that. But you'd see articles about, on some of the comments, the beginnings of fascism. The David Duke thing got some press over there. But I think that fundamentally the concern was more about is this an indication of a rise of nationalism that's going to sweep Europe? And don't forget, you already had right-wing parties gaining power in Poland, in Austria, in Hungary with Orban. You have the dynamic of what's happening with Erdogan in Turkey. And then, of course, you had the Brexit, and you had, what's his name, in the Netherlands? Wilders, yeah, who also lost, But in any event, so there's a lot of anxiety about that for sure. The thing that really blew me away in Germany is on election night, and don't forget we were 6 hours ahead of you guys, or no, 9 hours ahead of you, but 6 hours ahead of the polls closing. So it was 2 a.m. when the polls first closed. So we had, election night's like a huge deal for any embassy. So we had 2 big parties off-site. They each had about 2,000 people there. And, you know, Kimberly, my wife, and I are, you know, going to both of those. We're just doing nonstop press, or I'm doing nonstop press, a lot of commentating. And I was actually my gut was that actually Trump might win even going into election night. When I saw after what I thought were 3 pretty decisive debates in Hillary's favor and that the numbers were still like this, and then when I heard that they were going to Michigan and Pennsylvania in the last 2 days, I was, oh, this campaign's in trouble. So yeah, people are saying, oh, are you excited? Because they all knew about my relationship with the Clintons. I mean, I think actually, for a Democrat, I think I did a pretty good job of trying to be balanced in analyzing the election, or at least I tried to. But, you know, people saw that. But I then basically had to go live TV to live TV and narrate my way through what was happening, what was happening that night. And one of the TV studios, there was a big poll that was up on TV. It showed 88% of Germans wanted Hillary Clinton to win. 88%. 4% wanted Donald Trump. Now, to put a finer point on this, the Alternative for Deutschland, you know, the nationalistic, anti-Euro, anti-immigrant party in Germany at that point was polling around 15%. So that means that at least 11% of the self-identified supporters of AfD didn't want Donald Trump to be president. So that tells you kind of where Germany was on that. And but I think it gets back to, it was less about, you know, even the nationalism and, you know, who's supporting or whatever. I think it was much more what I said before about this anxiety, starting with the concern about the pivot to Asia, this anxiety that Germans and Europeans have about, you know, the U.S. drifting away. Sure. And so with a lot of people, it was more about Trump doesn't care about us, it's an isolationist foreign policy, you know, that kind of thing. And let me tell you, your average German is incredibly knowledgeable about and articulate about our political process. I mean, they can talk primary calendar with you, they can talk candidates, they can talk members of the United States Senate, governors who might be up-and-comers. I mean, it's really pretty extraordinary.
I agree about the anxiety. The famous line about NATO was, the point was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down.
Oh, I love that.
And
yeah.
keeping the Americans in was always a key part of that story. Mm-hmm. And obviously for Germans, a big
sure.
part. So last question before we open it up. I had the opportunity to go to Germany. I mentioned this to you before. Just 2 months ago, I spent time there before, but it was the first time in a while. And I was struck by how beautiful Germany is. I was in the South, and it occurred to me that so few Americans go and travel on vacation to Germany. It's just not people talk about France or Italy, but not Germany. So why is that? Why do you think we don't go enough?
You know, I think that, you know, it doesn't sort of have the sexy feel, although I must say that Berlin is now beginning. I talk to more young people who say Berlin is now my favorite city in Europe. It's kind of interesting. But, you know, part of it doesn't have the sexy feel of obviously a Rome or a Paris or even a London. I think part of it's hangover from the war. You have, we had a lot, I did an awful lot with survivors. And in terms of art provenance, in terms of working with Stu Eisenstadt and the Claims Coalition to get the Claims Committee to get additional revenues from the German government for survivors who were living a lot longer than the initial actuarial, you know, table suggested. And I had a lot of people come through. I mean, whenever there was you know, a Jewish, predominantly Jewish group, I always wanted to brief them in the embassy and have a conversation about all this. I had a lot of people come through that said, you know, the only reason we're here is because of you, because other than that, there's no way we would, you know, I could come, or if my parents were alive, there was no way I could come to Germany. And so I think for a lot of people, there are 2 elements of pleasant surprise. One is how well Germany has faced its history. And it's really pretty extraordinary. Now, it took them 2.5 generations to get there, but it really is pretty extraordinary. And you hear that comment a lot. But the second thing is people go, wow, this is a great place. Germany has something like over 65 World Heritage Sites. A number of towns and cities are you know, world heritage. I was constantly, this is a country that was 85% destroyed in rubble. And I was constantly going into, I went to over 150 places within Germany, 2 to 3 days a week. I was out of Berlin. You know, people said Berlin is to Germany as New York or Washington is to the United States. You've really got to get out. And because of all the principalities and independent Hanseatic cities, there are a whole lot of independent, you know, newspapers and television stations, and, you know, each region had its own, you know, business groups and civil society organizations and all that. So there's a lot for an ambassador to do in that regard. But I was constantly walking into an old city hall or a cathedral or something going, well, I guess this escaped, you know, damage during the war. And they go, oh no, it was 92% destroyed and rebuilt. And what happened, in part thanks to the Marshall Fund, was all these artisans from Eastern Europe came flooding into Germany after the war and helped in the rebuilding process. And it's really pretty extraordinary. And what you find is many of these cities have these extraordinary inner cores that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, they're, you know, I was in buildings that were, you know, 1,000 years old. I mean, I went to Olvera Street the other day and to meet with a group that we'd worked on immigration issues with refugee issues in Germany. They happened to be here with a group of Germans, and I walked by the oldest house in Los Angeles that was, you know, like not even 300 years old. And so to see, which is pretty cool for, you know, the States, right? But to be in Europe and to see, you know, and see all of that was pretty, you know, really pretty extraordinary. And there, you know, there's lots of areas with beautiful rolling hills, and of course you have the Alps and you have the Black Forest. And by the way, this myth about German food, I mean, you got some of the best restaurants in the world there. There are more 3-star restaurants in Germany than any other country except for France, as an example. So I'd say it's definitely worth going, and I got great tour guide recommendations for you if you go.
No doubt. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.